Dr. Savan Wilson was born and reared in Laurel, Mississippi. She received her PhD at the University of Mississippi. She worked in the field of education for over 45 years. Her first job was in a public library. She has been a school librarian, district library supervisor, director of education at Mississippi Educational Television, and a university professor. After retiring from southern Mississippi, she worked for 10 years for the Department of Defense schools in Italy, has lived in Fairhope for over 20 years, and one of her main volunteer jobs, aside from this, is preserving Fairhope history through her work at the Fairhope Single Tax Archives. And we are happy to have her here today to talk about A Valley So Low. Please help me welcome Savan Wilson.
Thank you so much for coming today. I've been really looking forward to this. I hope my voice is, because it's not good in the morning usually. The book's Valley So Low was a fascinating read. I kind of bought it and put off reading it and finally read it, and it was read almost like a novel. It was very, very interesting. And it tells the story of Kingston, Tennessee, and the coal ash disaster in 2008, and the legal battles that followed, and it may serve as a cautionary tale for us here today. I'm going to hit on the high points. There's a lot to this book. As I said, it's very readable, and I hope you'll read it. It is in the library, and I'm giving an extra copy I have away to the library today, so they'll have 2 copies for a while anyway. This was Jared Sullivan, the young man in the top's first book, and it took him 5 years to write. He didn't start writing it and learn about this situation until 2018. And so it tells the story of the coal ash, but he's a journalist, and he's an editor of Men's Journal, where the story first appeared. And he also was the editor of Field and Stream, a magazine I grew up with in my home in the early days. And he still lives in Tennessee. It's a story of ordinary people and people caught up in an environmental catastrophe. It's well-researched, has a great index, and highlights the long-term consequences, not just of the disaster itself, but what happens years after. In December 2008, just before Christmas, just before 1 a.m. in the morning, people were shocked when the north section of a dike at the TVA coal ash pond in Kingston, Tennessee, collapsed. This was not an act of nature, or a hurricane, or a bad storm. It just gave way, and it was preventable, as they had had dike leaks and also ruptures before. It tore a home off its foundations, and it also destroyed or damaged 28 other homes on the river, near the area. It was 3 million cubic yards of coal ash sludge that poured out onto the surrounding land and into the nearby Emery River. The infrastructure damage was huge. It included roads, gas lines, and rail tracks. Even a railroad car and its engine on the site was buried, and it took them 2 weeks to clean that out. Kingston remains one of the largest industrial spills in the United States history. But the spill was just the beginning, like I said, and what followed is the real story. When the dike failed, it released, I've given you some numbers, and you're going to hear different numbers, but we know gallons, we know tons, we know things, but it released over 1 billion gallons of sludge ash, gallons. And it hit 300 acres were buried in coal ash. Some was a foot deep, some was 6 feet deep. and the coal ash in the Emery River was a significant problem. That's 20 miles down from the Redstone Arsenal. And it also, they had to literally start dredging it almost immediately and also find a way to stop it from going downriver. I'll do questions right at the end if that's okay. It's easier because I may answer them before it's over with. And you may even know more than I do about it, so we'll see what we all know. Coal ash is not just dirt. It's a concentrated mix of heavy metals like arsenic, lead, and mercury, and probably 20 other mild toxic minerals. But when the coal is burned, all those toxins don't disappear. They stay behind in the ash. And when it gets dry, there's a potential for airborne toxic dust exposure that comes up like a windstorm or something. And toxic metals can remain in river settlements for decades and can cause cancer, damage to the brain, the nervous system, the kidneys, and bones. And it also damages river ecosystems. The heart of this book, and the main part of it, wait, let me back up. Sorry, I do this all the time. The heart of the book is the cleanup worker story. Hundreds of workers were quickly brought in almost overnight. TVA's main interest, I can assure you, was money and keeping costs as low as possible. The jobs were considered well-paying in 2008 for blue-collar workers who had many lost their jobs at other locations during that economic downturn. The pay was $15 to $25 an hour, and workers typically worked 12 to 16 hours a day so they could earn overtime. Many felt like it was a financial opportunity. They could pay off their house, they could pay their bills. They'd really had a horrible time the year before. And they thought almost like, wow, we won the lottery. How did we get so lucky to work here? But it ultimately cost many workers their health and their lives, with over 50 dying as a result. The cleanup company, Jacobs, that's in the bottom of your slide there, engineering, was paid approximately $100 million to manage the cleanup of a $1 billion oil spill. Jacobs had special clauses. This wasn't their first rodeo, I don't think. They had special clauses built in that if they did it as quickly as possible with no problems and no overrides, they would get a huge bonus of about $100 million or $1 million or something huge. They were also reimbursed, this was little known, for any legal bills if anyone was harmed by the coal ash. They had that clause built in. It would revert back to TVA. The workers did the dangerous labor, and the company did not protect them in any way. I want you to look at this slide because if you can look closely, which you can't that well, you see some maybe reflective gear. That was because they went to work at 5 or 6 in the morning and didn't leave until 8 or 8:30 at night, so they wouldn't get hit by some of that equipment that was probably running around. But you don't see gloves, you don't see masks, you don't see special hazmat equipment, protection, and so forth. But in the late fall of 2012, several years after the spill, 3 men came to lawyer Jim Scott's office and told them they were sick and that they each worked at the Kingston cleanup site and they thought they needed a lawyer. They had been told that coal ash was safe, that it was just dirt, and you could eat a pound of it a day and it wouldn't harm you. They had no idea of the toxins building up in their bodies. They explained that the officials with Jacobs Engineering were, with few exceptions, refusing them dust masks and their jobs were at risk if they tried to wear one anyway. Now the men feared something with their health had gone terribly wrong, as many had serious illnesses after working the coal ash. Remember, this was 2012. It happened in 2008. They were working in the coal ash each and every day. And even their families were experiencing some health problems just by washing their clothes. And during the summer, it was even worse as the coal ash would fly around like a huge dust storm, and the company would wet it down, and it would dry almost as fast because it was just flaky coal ash. So it was impossible not to breathe it most of the time. Now, the company gave this men free lunches, and the tent it was in was sitting on the top of coal ash. So some of this was just all around. You may not see it, but it was minute particles that were in the air. The book follows Ansel Clark and Janie, his wife, who are key characters, and many other workers talk during the narrative and have points to make about this whole story. These aren't activists. These aren't even educated people. They are people that took jobs believing they were helping to clean up a disaster. As illnesses mount, families began to ask whether there was another tragedy coming up, as over half had no insurance, and they didn't provide insurance. Now, the main people, Jim Scott, the lawyer, is central to this story as he seeks to learn more about coal ash and the lack of protection given the workers. It's a story about power versus accountability. Jim was 51 and lived in Knoxville. He didn't have big cases. You can look at him. He was a generalist. He was happy to take on DUIs, small criminal cases, and whatever else walked through his door. He was like a big frat boy, frankly. And you get that whole demeanor about him. He came from a lovely family. His father was a lawyer. But he was just somebody that kind of worked long, just did what he did. He'd earned a reputation locally, though, for handling toxic exposure suits, whether involving nuclear fuel or E. coli. That was how the men had found out about him. He also had a reputation for caring, and he had a reputation for not gouging you financially, and he had a reputation for getting back to you by phone. He represented some of the homeowners whose property had been damaged. Remember the 26 and the one off the foundations, and they were settled pretty quickly. He didn't handle all of them, but I'm sure they were a big help to him. But he couldn't imagine why any organization, certainly one as big as TVA, or even Jacobs for that matter, would ignore requests for basic protective gear. Yet the three men had almost no energy and had each gone to numerous doctors for various illnesses, and some had even been having short hospital stays. And besides Ansel and Mike and Jeff, Scott began to talk to other Kingston workers and others. He didn't meet them at his office. That might have raised a red flag. He met them at gas stations, at Shoney's, at Cracker Barrels, and at barbecue shacks. The workers all told him effectively the same thing, that Jacobs officials did not want the site to look like a disaster, dangerous site to the community, which was Knoxville. So they were denying them dust masks, not providing them with doctors. They went to the doctors on their own, and laying off anyone who pushed back. After about 5 or 6, Scott said, I thought this really might be going on. And Scott felt if he did not help them, no one would take this case. And that's probably true. Big money speaks big money. In August 2013, Scott filed a complaint on his own with the U.S. District Court in Knoxville against Jacobs Engineering Group on behalf of 50 workers and families. He had found that TVA was immune from lawsuits because it was a government agency. So Jacobs was the next best thing. However, the judge in 2024, which was a year later, also gave Jacobs immunity as a contractor. Scott then could only do one thing. He took the appeal to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, expecting not to win. He felt everything, that had come down so fast and for no real reason. He didn't expect to win. But to his surprise, he won the right to take it to a jury. This is a small-town lawyer. Jacobs Engineering main lawyer, is on the right, was Jimmy Sanders. This is really a thriller in many ways. A Vanderbilt grad with flowing silver hair and a silver mustache. Sanders had previously defended Exxon in the Valdez oil spill cases successfully, or saved them a lot of money at the least. This is a David and Goliath story. Jacobs is a huge contractor and earns about $12 billion a year in revenue. And they can have the highest, best team of high-profile lawyers against a small group of capable lawyers, but with few resources. In 2018, after years of depositions, and I put the picture of these are actual pages from things about this case. After a number of years of depositions going back and forth and many mediation attempts that fell through because they were just laughable, Scott was scheduled for a federal court that would finally have a jury hear their case. So that's in 2018, 10 years later. They almost broke them just getting all this material, and they'd load them up, they'd send them, the big company, the Sanders company would send them huge boxes of materials, and they'd have to go through all of them to find the one kernel that they could pick up something from. So they made it as hard as possible as they could. The first part of the trial would determine if Jacob had failed to protect the workers' health. Now, I was a marriage lawyer, but I don't remember this, or you could split trials up like that. Maybe some of you know about that as lawyers. And then if they won that, the second trial would then determine how much they would get in compensation. So they had one trial just to prove this had happened to them. But before the trial, Scott's law office burned down one night after much of the original documentation was lost. Fortunately, they had backed it up. But they still didn't have the originals, and it set them back several months just because, who knows, they never could decide, they never could figure out. Of course, everybody said it was an accident, but you never know, and they always wondered. So a lot was happening, and they worked for years doing this. The trial was brutal, and it's an important part of the book. By this time, when he went to trial, before he went to trial, he got other lawyers from other areas of other states even to come in and help him. They were all doing it on contingency. So they were putting out money, $1 million probably, just to get the materials all together and to know what they were doing. And then they went to court. There was a huge corporate defense, and there was significant scientific debate. It seems it's still hard to prove that toxic exposure legally is a problem. In fact, this was the first case of coal ash damages. So think of all of this information that they'd gathered and in respect to this one company. There was expert testimony Sanders could pay for the very best experts. Poor Jim Scott's team could get one, and he didn't even accept any pay. And he could not find enough literature to prove the toxicity. He had to go by review of the literature. He couldn't find studies. He could only go by the review of the literature. And they tried to throw him out because it didn't go deep enough. But it is what it is. You have what you have. There's nothing available on this still. Not much. We can't even prove that a lot of things happen health-wise with other things our group's doing. So it's very interesting. So there was expert testimony, high tension in the courtroom, and many emotional courtroom moments, particularly when the workers or their families spoke. They did find out, it did bring out their air monitor readings by the company and days of air quality that were measured showed some manipulation. They would pick the wet days to measure the air quality. And this was proven over and over again. And it was clear that the workers, while provided safety training and a manual and a little orientation, were let go if they acted as if their work was dangerous by wearing special clothing, their own respirators, or masks, and they were ordered not to. Over 4 weeks and 32 witnesses were testified during that period. A key moment came, and it wasn't the only one, when a former worker told the jury that Tom Bach, one of the other main people in the book, Jacob's own site head of safety, had once told him, "Man, if these people knowed what was in that ash, they'd quit," while telling them they could eat a pound a day and it would not hurt them. It's just amazing to me. Even a former TVA safety coordinator testified for the workers as to things he knew. Former, not working then. There is much more here that proved the workers' case was valid. And in the end, David beat Goliath, and the jury returned a unanimous verdict in favor of the workers. That was great. Now the workers won the right to go to the second phase of the trial, which would provide damages for the harm that had been done to their health. Now, if the first one took 10 years, you can imagine the second one. The next trial kept getting delayed due to numerous appeals by Jacobs to other courts. All their appeals failed. But in 2020, 2 years after the first case, Jacobs tried to settle for $35 million. $10 million in 2020. In 2021, Jacobs offered a settlement of $35 million. Now you have approximately 200 or more people being compensated. And in 2022, the Tennessee Supreme Court heard arguments on a minor legal technicality that I never could really realize what it was from my reading in the book, but a minor, in other articles, but a minor reading, a little technicality. And they heard arguments, but they never ruled on it due to some politics, and I want to mention that. The ruling had not, this is so political in so many ways. That ruling had not yet been answered or responded to when Tennessee Governor Bill Lee appointed Dwight Tarwater, who was Jacobs' new chief counsel on the Kingston spill. So the new Supreme Court justice that was put in the middle of waiting for the ruling was actually worked for Jacobs before. I don't know how you pick these people, but they handpicked that one. And at the time, attorneys on both sides of the Kingston case filed a stay or a pause with the state Supreme Court. It wasn't going anywhere, they could tell that. And the first clue that a settlement might be in the offering. 15 years after the spill, they gave them a settlement, a last settlement offer of $77.5 million in 2023. It was paid to 230 workers and families. That averaged about $200,000 per family. And 50 people had died. When they first started this, they were thinking million each or something. You know, there was a lot of money going around on these kind of issues then. The bottom line is they had to settle. They had done it. People were dying. People were in hospitals. People were having illness problems still. They had no money. The lawyers were practically out of money that were fighting it. And I think they just ended up settling it. And that's a sad ending to most of this book. But there's a little something extra in the book I want to take a minute or two for and tell you, because it's another outcome of this oil spill that you might want to know about. Well, let me try to get it to where I'm going now. Okay. Welcome to Uniontown, Alabama. I really was fascinated. This is kind of a PS slide, but I was just fascinated because of the sign that's, of course, not standing upright anyway, of Uniontown, says City with a Future. I don't think I've ever seen a city with less of a future in my life. And it's just an amazing thing with what happened. Uniontown in 2006, before the oil spill, Alabama Department of Environmental Management, our Alabama Department of Management, was reviewing plans to permit a landfill in Uniontown. Residents formed coalitions and signed petitions to oppose this landfill, this huge landfill, knowing it would bring unwanted pollution to their community. That was in 2006. 2007, however, the Perry County Commissioners approved the permit anyway, ignoring their arguments. Soon after, many cleanup sites from other states were sending their waste to Uniontown. Now then, December 2008 came. And we know that TVA needed to remove millions of tons of ash quickly. So guess where they decided to send it? To Uniontown, Alabama. The County Commission, the ADEM of Alabama, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. This is before the Environmental Protection Agency kind of got smart in 2015 and changed some rules. This was before that. All approved the decision to ship the toxic coal ash from Kingston, Tennessee to Uniontown, Alabama, 5 hours and 300 miles away. 4 million cubic yards of ash were loaded into those rail cars, those very rail cars, and shipped after they unearthed them from the coal ash pond, and shipped them uncovered to that landfill in Uniontown during 2009 to 2010. That was an interesting decision on someone's part. I have no idea what. I'd love to follow the money and be a forensic accountant and see who benefited financially significantly in Alabama for that Uniontown decision, because there's a trail there somewhere. I should mention, if you haven't figured it out already, that 90% of Uniontown's population, of approximately 2,300 people, are African American. And they have a per capita income at that time of less than $10,000. These are underserved, underrepresented, and able to be vocal people. In Tennessee, interesting enough, this is legal. The ash was treated as hazardous under the Superfund cleanup rules, which probably benefited Tennessee. But when it got to Alabama, the same ash in those railroad cars was reclassified as non-hazardous solid waste. I do not understand our government sometimes. Just think about that. Those are serious situations in that book. Strong odors, airborne dust settled onto homes, trees, yards, garden of vegetables, and drinking water. And Uniontown residents also began to have headaches, nausea, respiratory problems, skin irritations, and other health issues. They do to this day. I was with a conference, environmental conference, a week or two ago and met the person from Uniontown and had a good little conversation with her. A small group, led by this person I met, filed a civil rights complaint with EPA in 2013. It was finally rejected by EPA in 2018. Why do things take so long? For insufficient civil rights violations, which is what they were going after. But the shocking thing to me was in the meantime, when that was going through that court where they were questioning it, in 2016, to shut them up, the landfill, the owners of the landfill, sued local activists for $30 million just for talking about it and making a havoc about what they were doing in the town. The lawsuit was settled in 2017, and the residents won. They didn't win money, but they won the right to talk about the right for clean air and water in their community. This is called a I know Pam's going to get very upset about this one. This is called a SLAP lawsuit, strategic lawsuit against public participation. And you may see more of this in the future. I don't know. First time I've seen it. And it's meant to intimidate critics, silence public opposition, and usually through the process of burdening people with legal costs that they can't afford. You give up. You can't do anything about it. How many times have we heard that, This book is really, as I said, about power and accountability. What struck me most about the book was the courage of the workers and families over all that book's period and their persistence to seek accountability. They wanted accountability even more than the money. Somebody pay attention to us and what has happened. TVA, which made millions, and a cleanup company that made billions, from the beginning, they did not care enough to protect their workers and tell them about the dangerous conditions. And when resulting illnesses and death happened, they did not do the right thing, who just immediately compensating workers, paying their bills when they got sick. Instead, they drew them through years of legal court cases. And this was all about the money and profit at any cost, clearly. I admired Jim Scott. And so I learned so much about the legal system, and I learned so much about how people deal with these kind of things that don't have any way to solve it on their own. But he always did what was the right thing, even at great personal cost to himself. And there's more about that in the book. Who pays when industrial systems fail? And how do we measure justice in a situation such as this? And what is the responsibility of corporations to our communities? It challenges us to look at energy costs, whether they be coal ash or electricity or databases, data farms. I learned that legal victories, I knew that, but were not solved in a timely fashion, and often that ordinary people pay extraordinary costs. The book involves so much more. I've given you really a lot more than I usually would in a book review. I want you to read the book. But you need to know all of these things are going on, and the story in the book fleshes these out significantly. I've really only hit the high spots. So I really appreciate your attention and your coming, and I'll be able to answer any questions if I can. Thank you.